Welcome back. My name is Matt Reiners, and I'm one of the co-founders of Eversound, a company dedicated to improving quality of life for older adults by giving them the gift of hearing. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our first ever international guest and my friend Phil Moorcraft, VP at CLB, a company based in North Holland, but Phil resides in the UK. I've had the pleasure of meeting Phil on the conference circuit, and I think he's just got an amazing spirit to him, an amazing accent that I just had to have him on. So thanks for joining me today, Phil.
Hi, Matt. How are you? Good to talk to you all the way from the sunny UK. It makes a change.
Amazing. I love it. So, Phil, the most important question first, is Hogwarts real?
Oh, most definitely. Well, it definitely is to my daughter anyway. So she's a huge Harry Potter fan. And actually, interestingly, the filming was done about 5 miles from our house in a place called Gloucester Cathedral. So the hall where you go, where you see them eating all the dinner is actually is filmed just down the road from me. So yeah, so it's definitely real to her, mate. So yeah.
Amazing. It's real to me too. I'm definitely a Potterhead myself. So happy to hear that. And so Phil, I think you've got like a really interesting perspective, right? You live in the UK, you've obviously worked with communities over there, you're coming into the US market. And based on what you know between the two different markets, like what would you say are like the main differences or even the main similarities?
I think probably the main differences, the one that I picked up on straight away would be how legislation and different states, how different states are regulated differently. So in the UK, it's all done at a national level. So there's not a lot of, all the red tape is basically the same. So you don't have to go to check different legislation to different states. So that was probably the first thing that that I noticed from doing my research, is that it can vary quite considerably from state to state. Also, probably the other really obvious one would be space. So you guys have got a lot more space than the UK. So the way that you build communities is completely different than we see in the UK. We tend to have more specialist homes or specialist communities. So rather than having a big community where you'd have independent living, supported living, memory care, all on one big community, we'd have them separate. But we are now seeing a trend to actually copy what you guys are doing in the US. So we're seeing what we call them villages. So rather than communities, and they will have independent, supported memory care and skilled nursing all in one village. So they're probably the main similarities and differences that I've seen since I've been in the US.
Amazing. Yeah, and I'm so unfamiliar with kind of what's going in the UK, but it makes sense with like that space and all that sort of things and how you guys are thinking about it. And I love that you guys are calling them villages. You know, I think at times here in the States, there has been this, this movement to start calling them more communities and stuff and not just facilities. But I love the idea of village, right? Because it takes a village as we both raise our beautiful daughters.
Exactly. And we've also, so we've taken, in the UK, we've taken an approach from Holland as well. I don't know if you're aware, Matt, there's a community or a village in Holland called de Hodeweg.
I've seen a presentation on it actually, but yeah, you should share more with our listeners. It's awesome.
So basically their whole concept is that they build, so in the UK, when we get a bit of land, we build in the middle and we have all the space on the outside. So what they've done is they've reversed that, because we don't have as much space as you guys in the US and Holland share the same issues. What we're seeing now is we're seeing a tendency to build on the outside and then have the space in the middle. And what that allows people to do, it gives them more safety. So when we're talking about, mainly we're talking about dementia villages now. So the Hodeweg is a very successful dementia village. It was probably 25 years ahead of its time. And we're sort of seeing that trend as well. So we're now building on the outside of land and having all the space in the middle. So you've got that more of a community feel within a much smaller space. So that's something else that we've sort of seen sort of the UK adopting from our sort of neighbours from the other way, rather than the American way.
Love it. And yeah, we talk about some of the similarities and differences, and I'm curious if you're seeing any trends take place in the UK that might have not quite made it to the US yet.
Possibly. I mean, forgive me. I'm just to take it back a step, Matt. As you know,
yeah.
probably in 2020, I think it's out in Jacksonville. And then obviously we've had COVID here. And so my exposure into the US market has been basically the last 6 months. So I'm giving you my thoughts on a very limited, limited knowledge. But what we're seeing in the UK is a drive for innovation to do more than one thing. So previously we've seen, and probably post-pandemic, we've seen innovation or a drive for innovation to look at a certain problem. So let's take falls, for example. So let's say, what can we do to alleviate falls or to reduce falls? And we would look at one product for that one solution. I think now over COVID and all the issues around staffing and pricing and everything else that COVID brought with it, we're now looking, or UK companies now are looking to have a solution that just does more than one thing. So, again, being very biased, looking at the technology that acoustic monitoring solutions, it does many more than just fall reductions. It does improve sleep. So people are looking at products that do a lot more than just one outcome. And also the other thing that people are looking at is, what do we take away from that? So what data can we collect? Where does that data go? What do we do with that data? And how can we integrate other systems to get a better overview of what's happening within our homes? So you guys have people like Point Click Care. We have companies called PCS, very similar sort of product. So we look at how we can integrate our information into other technology to give the customer a better overview of what's happening within the homes. So that's the sort of drive that I'm seeing at the moment, is to look at sort of a wider picture rather than narrowing in on one product or one solution. It's getting a lot bigger and a lot wider.